Welcome to the second video in a series of videos for the course Future Societies at Hult Business School. Just want to recap a little bit on what we discussed in the first series of lectures. As you're well aware, much of what we discussed was around the importance of stories in shaping your own lives, and obviously the importance of stories in shaping the world that we live in. And importantly, as we discussed, the importance of stories in shaping and creating the future. We spent quite a lot of time discussing what stories were and what they meant. We also spent a little bit of time exploring myth, although we did seem to fall into the trap of seeing myth as conspiracy theories. But the fact of the matter is that stories are incredibly important. Without stories, there is no world, in a sense. So as long as we can hold on to that realization that there is power, there is meaning in the stories we tell. And as we move forward, I want us to think quite clearly about the situations we're facing and the stories that have led to those situations, which have precipitated the present moment. And as we'll see, issues around climate change, biodiversity loss, inequality, the rise of AI, whatever it may be, has a story associated with it. And if we can unpack those stories, unravel those stories, then we have some sort of understanding of where we've come from and where we're going. Something we also covered was around this sort of idea of how do we know the world? How do we sense the world? As I mentioned, we live in a very visual culture. And in a sense, this limits the way we experience the world. If we think about the way we share images, the way we use the internet, the way we use social media, it's very visually based. And what I want you to think about and want you to start to explore is the fact that we can sense the world differently, and perhaps through these different ways of sensing, we can then potentially come up with some different solutions to the issues we face. So over the coming weeks, I want you to start to open those senses, open your ears, for example, to listen to sounds and start to understand that those sounds also tell a story about the world we live in. In an urban setting, you're going to be experiencing very different sounds than you would in a rural setting or in a wilderness area. And so what do those sounds tell us about the world we live in? Equally, I want you to think about that whole idea of, as I say, sensing the world, but almost how can we change our consciousness through our senses? How can we start to engage the world differently, which will allow us to create alternative futures? Now, as we explored in the lecture, trying to experience the world differently is very difficult. And we joked about mind-altering drugs, alcohol, circular breathing, art, poetry, whatever it might be. But trying to engage with the world in a way that perhaps opens up new avenues for exploration. And I think this is so crucial, because unless we can start to explore the world with a different consciousness, we're likely to end up with a projection of what we already have. Now, in the following lectures, I will explore five elements which I think, if we engage with, will allow us to start to create a different consciousness. And that consciousness will allow us to start imagining and envisioning alternative futures. One thing we are going to look at is this idea of animism, contemporary animism, this notion that the world is alive, and to explore what that means. If we start to see the world as full of life, with a consciousness that isn't just human, and what does that mean in terms of how we connect to other life forms, to the more than human world, and how that can open up different avenues and possibilities for creating truly flourishing futures. So we will explore animism in quite a lot of depth, but importantly, not an archaic animism, a contemporary animism. And obviously I'll explain what I mean by animism in the future, but in the following lectures, but it's this idea that the world is alive, that the world is not just human consciousness. So we'll explore that in some depth. And then also I want to think about those beliefs that we hold on to, those dearly held beliefs that shape the world. And one in particular, the idea or the belief in progress, which is such an important idea that we all hold on to, and in a sense that shapes our politics and our economics, is this idea that we're on this sort of trajectory from this situation to somehow a better situation in the future. And, what does that idea of progress mean? How does it shape our worldviews? How does it shape the way we live? And is it even possible to think of a world where we don't conceive of a notion of progress? As we mentioned in the previous lecture, a lot of indigenous societies and sort of pre-modern societies saw the world as a series of cycles, and maybe that's a way forward as well, is not to keep on thinking, as I say, in this idea of a linear progress, moving from A to B, because in a sense that's caused a lot of our issues. This idea that you can only move from A to B if you have economic growth, for example. And perhaps thinking more in terms of cycles doesn't require that endless growth. Anyway, we'll explore the myth, the notion of progress, using some of John Gray's work. And as you'll see, I've posted on the discussion board or the announcements board a link to some of his work, because I think he raises some important ideas that we need to explore as we go forward. So, over the coming week, as I say, I'd like you to think about experiencing the world differently through different senses, starting to understand some of the signs and symbols that your senses engage with. What's going on in the world? How do we know what's going on in the world? How do we know what's real? How do we know what's just an illusion? How do we connect with processes? Thinking about the politics at the moment in the UK, so much is going on, but how do we unravel that? How do we make sense of it? And this is important, to make sense of the world and to start to understand how it works. And then to think about different ways of engaging with those processes, different ways of challenging preconceived assumptions and received wisdom. And I think the idea of animism allows us to connect more deeply to some of the processes that we need to engage with if we are to address the crisis we face. This knowledge, these animistic beliefs have allowed people to thrive in very inhospitable environments for thousands of years. It's allowed them to make deep connections with the more than human world, which has led to adaptability, adaptive capacity, and the building of resilience. And we're losing that. With our technological hubris, we're somehow transcending, or believe we can transcend, those beliefs and those connections. So, just as I say, you've got some readings, but also, so important with this course is reflect. Give yourself time to reflect. Give yourself time to sit in quiet spaces. Give yourself time to walk around noisy, boisterous streets and just get a sense of the world. Get a sense of place. Get a sense of yourself in that place. And start to think about what sort of future you want to see, what sort of future you want to create, and what issues need to be addressed in order to achieve those futures. So thanks again for listening. I look forward to seeing you soon.